Good Tuesday evening, everybody. Rob O'Connor here from RobVenoSports.com with our Week 6 early look ahead to college football and a look back at what we saw and learned in Week 5 of the college football season. And to discuss all of this and the biggest games of Week 6, we need to bring in the founder of Rob Veno Sports, Rob Veno. Rob, how are you this evening?
I'm doing great, Rob. How about yourself?
Doing very well. Glad to be here. Lots to talk about. Not only do we have to break down what we saw and look ahead to some big Week 6 matchups, we have a hurricane roaring down in the Caribbean that could affect a lot of East Coast games this weekend from the Carolinas down to Florida. So we'll definitely need to spend a few minutes educating our listeners on how to bet these games with so much uncertainty in terms of what the conditions will be at kickoff, and if there'll even be a kickoff at all in some cases. So we got a lot to go through this week. Let's jump right into it, and we'll start with what we saw early last weekend, and that would be the Friday night game between Stanford and Washington. Really wasn't much of a game at all. After halftime, Washington just taking it to Stanford. Big, is Washington that good? Was Stanford a little overrated? Bad spot for them? Some kind of combination of the two?
Yeah, well, it's probably a small combination of the two. Washington, obviously at home in an isolated game, was cranked up to play. But Stanford was so banged up, Rob. Washington took advantage of Stanford injuries for sure. They were to the point where really there was only one weapon on the field where Stanford was concerned offensively, and that was Christian McCaffrey. The wide receiving corps took some big hits prior to the game, during the game. Defensively, they took hits in their secondary before the game. So Washington had a lot in their favor as far as health issues were concerned. The personnel on the field was better on Washington's side, and they were ready to play. I mean, you have to, play the hand you're dealt, and Washington got a favorable hand dealt to them last Friday night, and they took full advantage. Total yardage not even close. They outgained Stanford by 211 total yards. At the line of scrimmage, they were extremely dominant, sacked Stanford 8 times in that game. So big win for the Washington Huskies. Now the Pac-12 schedule doesn't necessarily get any easier because you play 9 Pac-12 games, and it'll be a bit of a road to hoe for Washington. But they're certainly in a good position at this point in time in that North Division of the Pac-12, because when you look through it, in all honesty, it looks as if Stanford is the only real competition. You just have to avoid slip-ups now against, Oregon, Cal. I don't think Oregon State is much this season, so it's and Washington State might be your toughest opponent the rest of the way out in the Apple Cup.
Well, we will definitely be talking about that Washington-Oregon game a little later on, as Washington now faces a road test in the Pac-12 coming off of the big win. We'll get into that one in just a little while. Before we do that, though, we'll keep moving through some of the other games we saw. I don't think there was a more dramatic or crazy ending than what we saw between the hedges on Saturday afternoon. It looked like Georgia had a win, and then a Hail Mary pass changed all of that on the final play of the game, giving Tennessee a dramatic 34-31 victory. Rob, is Georgia going to be able to bounce back from this at all, and can Tennessee use the momentum of such a dramatic win moving forward? They have a really tough game this coming week against A&M. We'll talk about that a little later. But in terms of just what we saw on Saturday, any recovering from this for Georgia?
Georgia, Rob, is 1 4th and 10 touchdown pass late in the game away from losing 3 straight contests in Columbia, Missouri 3 weeks ago. they could have easily lost that game. And then prior to that, they struggled with Nicholls State, only won by a couple of points. So they've got some issues. Now, they should have won this ball game. I mean, what's happening to Georgia, or what did happen to Georgia in this game, is the exact opposite of what's been happening to Tennessee. I mean, as unlucky as maybe Georgia was here, Tennessee really has been, you could call it a bit lucky with their schedule so far. Lucky to get out of the game with Appalachian State with a victory, trailing Florida 21-0, have to make a monster comeback, did not look impressive against Ohio U. And then for all intent and purposes, in this contest, we're beaten by Georgia. Everywhere except the scoreboard, Georgia wins all the statistical battles in that contest. So, it's very tough for Georgia at this point in time, that's for sure. Kirby Smart's got his hands full trying to bring his team back, but I think when it's a first-year coach and new systems on both sides of the ball, it's kind of easy for the team to continue playing hard and continue to try and go through the process to make things work. That's why they brought Kirby Smart in there. Boy, for Tennessee, Butch Jones, like I say, very thankful to be where they are at this point in time, because things could really be a lot different for the Tennessee Volunteers right now.
Absolutely, and they're going to face another really tough test this weekend. Another game that had a not quite as dramatic ending, but was very good throughout. Lots of back and forth, especially in the second half of that football game, was Clemson and Louisville, and really just a poor decision on fourth down by a young receiver to not be aggressive and turn up field and try and take some contact and get that extra yard, or you might be looking at a different result. But Clemson gets a big fourth down stop, come up about a yard short of a first down, does Louisville. That would have set them up with first and goal very late in that game. And Clemson remains undefeated. Louisville has a loss now, and it makes the race in the ACC very, very interesting.
Yeah, that Atlantic Division now, if we look at the three teams at the top of that particular division, what's left is a Clemson-Florida State matchup, which will take place on October the 29th at Tallahassee. As we see things right now, Rob, I think Clemson would be your slight favorite in that game. Florida State certainly has had issues throughout the season thus far, but Clemson's put themselves in a real good spot. They have to come back this week on a short work week and go up to Boston College and play a very tough BC defense, so you can't be flat in any division games from here on out. But it was a big win for Clemson, a big bounce back for Deshaun Watson, who had a very good game. We talked about this game last week, and you always figure that when a prominent player at a position is overshadowed in the media leading up to the game by his counterpart, and it kind of puts a little chip on the shoulder. And I thought that all the talk about Lamar Jackson coming in might light a fuse under Deshaun Watson. Certainly he played well. Jackson played well, to his credit also. But I think Bobby Petrino's team showed real well. Just somebody had to lose that game, and it wound up being very close, and Clemson came out the home winner. But Louisville racked up 31 first downs against a very good defense. So I don't think you downgrade Louisville at all because of that loss, that's for sure.
No, I don't either. I think it's just going to be a matter now of them needing to catch a break, and Clemson's going to need to slip up somewhere else. I mean, there's probably only going to be 2 one-loss teams in that division at most, and that would be Clemson and Louisville, and Clemson would obviously have it on head-to-head. Florida State kind of avoided a doomsday scenario where there'd be 3 one-loss teams and they all beating each other in round-robin play, because they lost a game to UNC on Saturday afternoon on a 54-yarder as time expires Florida State really let one slip away there. UNC looking pretty strong after a struggle early in the season against Georgia. They've bounced back nicely, very similar to what they did after losing to South Carolina the year prior.
Yeah, it's just a couple of big weeks at the end of games for the North Carolina Tar Heels. They came from behind to defeat Pittsburgh at game's end. They come back this week from what looked like a loss, 24 seconds left in the game. DeAndre Francois scores for Florida State. And in those final 24 seconds, North Carolina is able to get the ball downfield enough to kick a 54-yard field goal to win it. They played well in that contest, and they had a monster lead against Florida State. But Florida State has shown us again that being down 21-0 doesn't mean all that much to their offense. They made the comeback, but then the disappointing loss at the end. Good win for UNC. Obviously, they're on the other side of that ACC. They're in the Coastal Division. So it puts them in a pretty good spot at this point in time. But that division has, it's very even over there, Rob. When you talk about having opponents like Virginia Tech and Miami, that division could get a little crazy in the weeks to come. So that was a huge win for UNC. Mitch Trubisky and company looked real good. We have to keep track of the injuries there. We saw Elijah Hood leave the game, star running back for UNC, and for a brief moment we saw Ryan Switzer, their top wide receiver, leave the game. So just check into UNC as far as player availability goes this week, because this Virginia Tech matchup, like I just said earlier, in the Coastal Division is a huge one for both teams.
And finally, before we move on to games this coming weekend, we'll briefly touch on the Big 12. They escaped the weekend with two undefeated teams still, just barely. West Virginia with a 17-16 home win against K-State. Baylor with a monster fourth-quarter comeback against Iowa State. The only time they led that game was at the very end when they kicked a 19-yard field goal to win it 45-42 over Iowa State. So the Big 12 lives on to see their playoff hopes alive, at least for a little while longer, Rob.
Yeah, boy, that Baylor comeback was quite the comeback, and disappointing for Iowa State because they played so well. They've figured out how to use that quarterback rotation with Lanning and Park to their benefit. Certainly they run the ball well with Mike Warren and Alan Lazard, one of the top receivers in that conference. So they've got offensive weaponry, and they used it to get out to the big lead. But to their credit, Baylor, like you say, they came back. They used a lot of their ground game to come back along with their passing game. But for Baylor, 469 yards rushing was the key. And Iowa State just couldn't stop them. I mean, we know Baylor to be a very good passing team over the course of the last few years, the Art Briles era, and into this season. But what gets lost somewhat, Rob, is the fact that spread offense can run the football and pound you into submission as well, and that's what they did last week against Iowa State. Be interesting to see how Iowa State bounces back off of that. I think they've got a good thing going there. Matt Campbell, new head coach, came over from Toledo, has Iowa State going in the right direction. But for Baylor, like you said, it was survival at its best, and now we'll see if they can continue on and run the gauntlet in the Big 12. I talked about the ACC Coastal being very competitive with teams that are evenly matched. Boy, the Big 12 is the same. We see it week in and week out. There's about 6 teams, maybe 7 teams on any given week that could beat one another. So it's a tough schedule to make your way through. You have to take wins however you can get them. And for West Virginia, that's exactly what they did last week. It wasn't pretty by any stretch of the imagination. And for Kansas State, which got off to an early lead in this contest and really, for the most part, has the advantage in the first half. But you can't kick field goals. And kicking field goals when they had opportunities is what cost K-State in the end. If they had turned some of those opportunities into touchdowns, they would have been the winner rather than the loser. Bill Snyder's team, much like the game earlier this season against Stanford where they covered, very game effort, but not enough to get them into the winner's circle. We'll see how they bounce back this week against Texas Tech.
Rob, good analysis and recap of what we saw last week. As always, any teams make a huge jump or take a big fall in your power rating?
I think the teams that are falling, Rob, continue to fall. And, you know, just to put it into context, you look at teams like Bowling Green, which just continues to spiral downward each and every week. Teams like Arkansas State and Northern Illinois and Nevada, teams that have just spiraled all season long, continue to spiral. I think if you want to pick one team that wasn't in the top 10 this year but was still inside the top 25 that has really fallen power ratings-wise, it would be the Oregon Ducks. They've taken a bit of a hit since the beginning of the year. They've dropped 5.5 points in the power ratings. It's an injured, banged-up football team, and so you could throw them into the category of, you know, probably the most prominent team in the nation that has fallen in the power ratings. Another one that has been real good over the last few years, but has fallen in the power ratings this season, is Western Kentucky out of Conference USA. With Brandon Doughty, the last 3 years, Western Kentucky's rolled up scores on everybody in CUSA. But this year, downward spiral for them as well. So those are a couple teams that have been on top in recent history and now are finding themselves not getting as much respect in the point spread, and rightfully so.
Well, Rob, I think the Oregon comment there of them falling is a good transition into our first game to look at for this coming weekend. Washington traveling to Oregon, coming off of a huge, as we already discussed, 44-6 win over Stanford. Oregon coming off a very disappointing 51-33 loss to Washington State. Is this a letdown spot for Washington? Does Oregon even have enough to be able to throw and upset the way of Washington on Saturday?
Yeah, it'll be dependent upon, I think, which Washington shows up, right? The good news for Washington is they won that game against Stanford, and they played on Friday night. So they get an extra day of preparation here, or however they use the extra day. They could have used the extra day just to take a deep breath and then get back to work. But having the extra day, I think, is helpful for the Washington Huskies, get the memory of that huge win out of their heads and get back to work. Chris Peterson, very good head coach. You know, he did wonders with Boise State the time he was there, and he certainly has turned Washington around very quickly. So I don't know that you'll necessarily find this to be a flat spot for Washington. I know one of the knee-jerk reactions would be that win was so huge. That game was so anticipated against Stanford in a battle for the top of the division that perhaps after that type of win, Washington hasn't had one of those types of wins in a long, long time. So perhaps, like I say, the mechanical thought process would be they're going to fall flat this week against Oregon. I just don't know. I think the extra day helps them. And as I said earlier about Oregon, it's just a banged-up football team. Now, whether or not all the players that are injured don't participate this coming week is another story. But they're going to play with a lot of beat-up players in this contest. And it affected them against Washington State, and it'll probably affect them again. One thing we know, if there's one huge fundamental difference between these two teams, it's certainly the physicality of the defenses. Oregon's defense, they went out this offseason and hired Brady Hoke to be their defensive coordinator, and I don't say that was a bad hire. That was probably a good hire to get Brady Hoke, but he's going to need some time to get the correct pieces into that defense to change what's been a very soft unit for a lot of years now. I mean, Oregon's label defensively has been soft for a long, long time, and it's been earned. They totally earned that label as soft. Last week against Washington State, the Washington State Cougars under Mike Leach, not necessarily known as a running team, but I watched that game from opening kick till final gun, and they ran the ball when they wanted to, right down Oregon's throat, especially second half. Oregon had no prayer from mid-third quarter to the end of the game of stopping Washington State anytime they handed off. That's got to change if they're going to beat Washington, and I don't know that they can change that, Rob. They just don't have the personnel at this point in time to change it. So we see Washington open up a pretty strong road favorite in this particular contest. Power ratings, suggested they should only be -5. But we see 9.5 out there right now. And I'd almost have to agree with where the line is right now more than I agree with the power rating, because the power ratings only include raw talent. They don't include the extenuating circumstances. I think those outside circumstances are hugely in favor of Washington, one being the injuries, like I said earlier, and two being the fact that Washington had the extra day off. There's a team that's hungry right now, and I don't know that Oregon has that same look at this point in time.
Well, I think the other issue is, as you mentioned, Oregon having trouble stopping the run. Washington's a team that can run the football, and I think that could end up causing Oregon a lot of trouble. I don't necessarily know they'll be able to make all the adjustments they need to make, or have the talent to make all the adjustments they need to make to stop the Washington ground attack.
I totally agree. I mean, and what it does for Washington, when you can unleash Myles Gaskin and get that running game going, is it opens up the passing game. And like I say, Oregon just doesn't have the bodies right now on the defensive side. You saw those guys, I don't want to get too dramatic about it, Rob, but they were picking up Oregon bodies and taking them off the field quite often in those 4 quarters last week. So like I say, a lot of them will play this week, but they're going to play with nagging injuries, and you just don't want to play a power team like Washington. All the years that Oregon was really good and winning the North, their biggest trouble came with Stanford, the power team in that division. Some years they got them with their speed, and some years they got run over by the Stanford power. Right now, I don't know that they're good enough to beat a power team as good as Washington or Stanford. So it could be, a middle-of-the-road standings-wise finish for them. And, Oregon could potentially, Rob, I'd be honest with you, they could potentially fight their way to a bowl bid this year if things don't get better. Let's not forget they've already lost to Nebraska. They just lost to Washington State. They have Washington and Stanford coming up. I mean, 6 losses could come real quick. You need 6-6 just to get into a bowl game. So this is a different season for the Oregon Ducks.
Let's move ahead to another team that has been struggling defensively, to say the least, and that would be Texas Longhorns. They got pretty well run over by Oklahoma State on Saturday, 49-31. Coach Strong back on the hot seat. He was kind of a little bit on the hot seat last year heading into the Red River rivalry, and Texas played one of their best football games of the year against Oklahoma. Got the win 24-17. Oklahoma opened Big 12 play last week with a 52-46 win over TCU. Oklahoma's defense hasn't looked good either. They've given up 88 points in their last 2 games, has Oklahoma. And they did get past TCU because they scored 52, still gave up 46. They've got some defensive questions. That 46 is coming on the heels of giving up 42 to Ohio State. What do you see in this one in terms of Texas needing to really get the win, to rally around their coach who's really come on the hot seat, and Oklahoma, who still has a chance to have an undefeated Big 12 season?
Yeah, it's an interesting game, Rob, because we just talked about Oregon and Washington, and even as the home team, I don't think either one of us were considering taking Oregon, even though they're getting substantial points in that contest. But here, I kind of view it differently. Oklahoma's a 10-point favorite on a neutral field. They play this game at the Cotton Bowl. And after watching them again get torched by TCU last week, and let's face it, Texas has as good of offensive weapons as TCU does. It seems like every Big 12 team has as good of offensive weapons as their opponent on any given week. The only one that falls short in that category of the top 7 or 8 is Kansas State. But Texas has the capability to score points on Oklahoma, and they could. Last year they beat them, and certainly Oklahoma, there'll be a bit of a revenge factor to this game for them because it's such a heated rivalry. But I'm not so sure that they can win this game by more than 10 points. Bob Stoops' team bounced off the mat nicely. They had a bye week heading into last week's game against TCU. As you mentioned, played a real good, half, 2.5 quarters, and then here came the TCU freight train from behind. And you almost felt like if the game was a couple minutes longer, TCU was going to come back and win that game. So I don't know that Oklahoma has solved anything. Yes, they won a game, but let's not forget that TCU is a beat-up defensive club as well. Gary Patterson's got issues there with that defense from a personnel standpoint. So I don't know how much stock I can put into that win as far as calling it Oklahoma turning a corner. I think Texas is a real live underdog here. They'll come to play. And like I said earlier, if this gets into a slugfest, or into a scorefest, this isn't one of those years where Texas can't go stride for stride with Oklahoma. We could see 52-46 all over again, just like we saw with Oklahoma TCU last week. Texas has been through those games already this season. They played one against Notre Dame. They played one against Cal. They may play 3 or 4 more the rest of the year. That's just the way they're built at this point in time. So I think points might be a little bit too heavy here for Oklahoma to cover.
Yeah, I expect a shootout. I don't think we'll be seeing 24-17 as the final. 24-17 could end up being a halftime score in this one. But unless these two teams have been disguising their defenses all year and just hiding out, waiting for this game to show up and play each other, I think you're going to see a lot of points in this one as well. A game where you might not see as many points, might be a little bit more of a true SEC defensive battle is Arkansas and Alabama. Alabama entering on off of a home-ho 34-6 win over Kentucky, just kind of took care of business and was never really in any danger of losing that game. Arkansas coming in off of a 52-10 win over Alcorn State. A little bit embarrassing that they're scheduling a team like Alcorn State, but nonetheless, they took care of business and won that game handily, and now they have a huge showdown with Alabama. A loss to Bama would drop them to 0-2 in the SEC West, and I don't think you can recover from 0-2. Does Arkansas have a chance, or is Bama just too much for them?
Yeah, I think Arkansas is one of those teams that always has a chance, Rob, just because they're physical in nature. That when you get into the trenches with Arkansas, you're going to get into a ball game, and there's a lot of times where Alabama, whether it be in or out of conference, manhandles the other side in the trenches with their defensive front seven, with their offensive line. So I think when you play Arkansas, a team that's built on toughness, on running the football, and on play action the way Brett Bielema's team is, at least the matchup, fundamentally, they're not an overwhelmed football team, Arkansas isn't, when they play Alabama. Here they'll get them at home, which is a good thing for them. Last year, when they played Alabama, they lose the game 27-14, but covered the 16-point number. So that was a close game. The year before, they lose 14-13 and cover the 9-point number. So the last couple of years under Bielema, they've certainly played this team very tough. Alabama, still the best team in the country where power ratings are concerned, and I think where every poll is concerned as well. So it's a tough road for Arkansas. But to get them at home, and like I say, to match up the way that they do, you have to execute almost flawlessly against Alabama to beat them. Just ask Ole Miss. Ole Miss had that big lead and then started to make a couple of mistakes, and they wound up losing that game. So you have to play 60 minutes of flawless football to win. But, to cover a point spread in this game at home, Arkansas plus 14 points, I think that's fairly reasonable to ask. We'll see how it goes. You don't like to bet against that freight train known as Alabama, but there are certain circumstances, I think, where, and this would be one of them, where the other team's probably good enough and the situation probably lends itself to a tight game. I think that's what we might find.
I mean, I think you go back to Arkansas's first game of the year in terms of SEC play against A&M, and you're talking late third quarter, early fourth quarter of that game. They're right in it. They have the ball on the 1 yard line, 4th and goal, and they don't get in, and that swung the entire momentum of that game. They get a touchdown there. This spread might not be as big as it is if they had beat Texas A&M.
Yeah, the power ratings say it should be 12.5 and not the 14 that it is. But you're absolutely right. The numbers sway so much on week-to-week results, and odds makers anticipating what the public view or perception of a certain team is, and they'll pad that into the number. And that Arkansas perception nationally could have been very much changed, like you say, had they had gone in and scored there and perhaps won that football game against A&M. Instead, what we see here in Week 6, national coverage here on a Tuesday, early evening, is Texas A&M being applauded for where they're at. And that just goes to your point to show you what a difference that one play may have made in the way people look at these two squads. So Arkansas, again, you try to treat every single game as its own individual entity. We don't like to throw a blanket statement over any contest. But when you look at this one, just on fundamentals, just on the people that are going to be on the field, I think that Arkansas is, they're built on toughness like every Brett Bielema squad is. And I know that the bugaboo for Nick Saban defenses has been mobile quarterbacks. They've really caused them a lot of trouble. But I think the last couple of years we've seen that, this team that doesn't get steamrolled by Alabama's strength gives them a lot of trouble as well.
Well, Rob, I think you did an excellent job transitioning us into our next game by mentioning Texas A&M, and they are going to be hosting Tennessee. A&M off of a unimpressive 24-13 win over South Carolina, but anytime you get a road win in the SEC, regardless of who the opponent is, it's a solid victory nonetheless. So they did what they had to do and got the win there. They did not cover in that game. And then, as you all know, Tennessee manages to escape Georgia 34-31 on the Hail Mary. They also missed covering that spread as well. What do you see in this game? Is A&M really as good as people perceive them to be? Is Tennessee really as good as their record indicates, or have they gotten a lot of luck to this point, and maybe that luck's about to run out on what's a really bad spot for Tennessee this week?
Yeah, I think that's what you have to project, and everybody's opinion is going to be different, Rob. I think the two lines of thinking would be Tennessee's a really, really good football team that is yet to play their best football, and they've survived up until now, and maybe their best football is to come in these next 7, 8 games. Or the other line of thinking is, Tennessee was overrated heading into the season. We see it in their results over the first 5 games. And perhaps now that the schedule is getting more difficult and, you're in a travel situation against a good team, we know every contest in the SEC, just about every contest in the SEC is a virtual war, that they won't be able to survive an entire season. It's an interesting question. And like I say, it's dependent upon the individual handicapper or better which way they think this team is going to go. For me, the power ratings showed Texas A&M -3, so that's a good starting point. They're currently, they opened 5, they've been bet up to 7, so the money likes Texas A&M obviously early on. And perhaps the predominant thought process is that Tennessee has been lucky, and they won't be able to survive against the better teams as they go through their schedule. If for A&M, there's a couple of key injuries here that you really have to look at. You have to make sure that Myles Garrett is going to play. Without Myles Garrett, the bookend defensive ends, he and Deshaun Hall, it's a different story. If Myles Garrett can't go, he's got an ankle injury here. They're also banged up at the wide receiver position. They're deep. A lot of depth at wide receiver, but you got question marks next to Ricky Seals-Jones and Speedy Noyle this week. That's something you have to look at as well. So from the A&M side, there's some important injuries that they're dealing with. For Tennessee, I don't know that we saw drastic improvement in their offensive line, which has really been the focus of a lot of criticism so far this season. Yeah, they scored a bunch of points against Georgia, but if we take away the 7 Hail Mary points late and look at what they did through the course of that game against what's a fairly weak Georgia defense, I mean, they've been lit up 3 weeks in a row now. Drew Lock lit them up for over 500 yards. Ole Miss lit them up from the get-go. And then last week, of course, they get beat by Tennessee. So it's not a really good defense. I don't know how much their offensive line has improved, if at all. And if we do see Myles Garrett for Texas A&M, that defensive front could give Tennessee all kinds of trouble. That could be your fundamental mismatch of the game. John Chavis' front 7 against that Tennessee front line. And Joshua Dobbs could be forced into a couple of mistakes and be running for his life. So like I say, check the injuries before you get involved in this one. We see a total here of about 55.5, 56. Seems somewhat fair, but I have to tell you that I think that it might be a little low. I could almost see these two teams getting into the 60s in this contest. Texas A&M was in the ultimate flat spot last week when they played South Carolina. They came off of that big win against Arkansas at the Dallas Cowboys home stadium, AT&T Stadium, like we talked about just a couple minutes ago. And then you're going to South Carolina, a team that's showing no signs of life whatsoever. You got a couple of nagging injuries. And it's, understandable that they scoot out of there with an 11-point win, just enough to get by, but not enough to cover a point spread. Here they'll be up again, fully focused for Tennessee. So I think you'll see a better effort. And I think that total might get eclipsed here. We'll have to keep an eye on that and see which direction it goes. But like I say, it comes down to your own personal opinion of Tennessee right now, which way you play this game. For me, I've liked A&M from the outset. As we know in the college football betting guide that we published earlier this season, Texas A&M was in that 12-team list of teams to play on this year, teams that we thought would be real good against the point spread. They have not disappointed this season where that's concerned, and I think that they'll probably be better than Tennessee here. A little bit of a concern for me, Rob, is the fact that the game's already pushed to 7 points. You don't want to get too carried away laying a lot of points in a game with a very, very capable underdog like Tennessee is.
Absolutely. I mean, I favor A&M in this game as well, but the spread is definitely moving against those planning to bet A&M. The number gets heavier and heavier as we move through the week. Well, I just need to remind all of our listeners here that Rob Veno Sports is the ultimate destination. That's robvenosports.com for all of your latest handicapping news and, most importantly, weather reports. And I say that because we're recording this show on a Tuesday. It is an early look show. And the next 2 games that we're going to talk about, Florida State and Miami and Virginia Tech at UNC, are both played on the East Coast in Florida in the Carolinas. There's currently a major Category 4 hurricane floating down in the Caribbean somewhere about Haiti, Cuba, here on a Tuesday evening, and it is projected to go up the Eastern Seaboard over the weekend, Friday through Sunday. A lot can change between now and then, but there has been some talk and rumors of some football games potentially being affected this weekend. Some of the bigger ones include EC South Florida, Notre Dame NC State, LSU in Florida, Virginia Tech UNC, UMass Old Dominion, Georgia South Carolina, and the next game we're going to talk about, Florida State and Miami. The timing of the storm is still a little bit up in the air. How close it's going to come to the coast, if it'll make it direct landfall, is still up in the air. So we're not quite sure necessarily what conditions these football games are going to be played in, which is why it's very important to get to the website as game time approaches to see what the latest is going to be. Anything else to add to that, Rob, before we get into the game itself?
Yeah, I think you'll notice, Rob, that there's a couple of games, the Virginia Tech North Carolina game included, where the total has really been pushed downward in anticipation of bad weather. Guys like to jump the gun and be proactive. You can always find your way out of it if the storm takes a turn and doesn't hit. But that Virginia Tech North Carolina game's been affected. Actually, if you go to the RobVenoSports.com website, you will find the free play that I posted up there this week. It has to do with the Syracuse-Wake Forest game. That game has been pushed down a little bit total-wise from 55 to 53.5 or 53. Certainly weather could affect Winston-Salem, which could play a little bit of havoc with the Syracuse extreme tempo offense. Wake Forest, more of a plodding style, traditional sort of, rush offense. I think what we look for most as handicappers, Rob, is not necessarily rain. Torrential rain obviously is a big factor, but wind is the real factor in a lot of these handicaps. We really put wind atop the list of things that will affect the way we bet or handicap games. And with a hurricane, you never know how strong these winds are going to be, but we see what they are right now. We see what they're projected to be by Saturday, and if you get into a contest where you have rain and, if you have 45-mile-an-hour winds, which is light in a hurricane, but say you're just getting remnants of the hurricane, 45-mile-an-hour winds will take a passing team. It'll take half the game away from a passing team because the 2 quarters that you spend going into the wind are absolutely worthless. You have to run the football. So that's why you see some movement in numbers, and it's really important to look at wind velocity, wind speed. As I said, torrential rain has an effect on things, especially on grass fields. Quarterbacks can't really see. By the time 10 minutes are played, nobody can cut anymore. Some of these artificial surfaces do drain a lot better than others. But like you were saying to everybody earlier, make sure you take a look, see what's going on in these cities. They still don't know exactly where it's going to hit. But I saw as of 30 minutes ago that South Carolina is going to be evacuated on the coast as well. So lots of people making preparations right now today on Tuesday.
Yeah, I think handicappers are also making their preparations and driving some of these totals down. But wet weather doesn't always necessarily mean a lower scoring game if the wind isn't too terrible. I mean, we'll go to the NFL and you look at the game Sunday night between Pittsburgh and Kansas City. There was some rain in that game. There was a little bit of wind. There was a missed field goal by Kansas City because the kicker lost his footing trying to kick the ball, and that game still went comfortably over the point total. So if you're looking at it from the opposite side of things, you might be able to catch some value later in the week if the forecast changes a little bit and things don't necessarily look as bad with some of these driven down totals. If you time it right, you might be able to get in on the bottom before they start going back up if you like the over in any of these games that are being affected.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true, Rob. And over the years, I've used that to my advantage as well. If I could give everybody the guidelines that I use, when wind gets above 25 miles per hour, I usually take notice. 25 miles per hour, strong-arm quarterbacks can cut through that wind. It really doesn't make that much of a difference. There are certain stadiums in the NFL, just because you just referenced the NFL, like the Meadowlands, where the wind swirls rather than blow one way or the other. But if it's 25 miles per hour or less, it's really not going to be much of a factor in passing games. Remember, that's all you're looking at here. It really affects the passing game, and it may affect special teams somewhat. But 25 miles per hour and lower, really not a consideration. It has to get above that. 30 and above, we start really paying attention. And the rain, like you said, and I said earlier, if it's torrential and it causes vision problems for a quarterback, for receivers, then it's a problem, and especially on a grass field. But if it's just rain, and we saw in that Pittsburgh game Sunday night, I think it was right before halftime, it started to come down like crazy. But when they came out of the locker room for the second half, it had subsided quite a bit, and things got back to normal. If you have that torrential stuff for 4 quarters, it's just difficult for people to move the football. So check the forecast, like you've been saying, Rob. And as a general rule of thumb, use the number 25 as far as wind speed is concerned. And when you see 25 above it, take note. Underneath, anything from 25 down, I don't think really makes a difference.
Let's start with Florida State, Miami. I would think, based on the forecast at this point, this of all the East Coast games down in the South, this one probably has a good chance of not being impacted so much by the rain. It's a late Saturday kickoff, and by that point, the storm should be a little bit to the north and more or less have passed through the Miami area. That's not to say there won't be some leftover rain or maybe some winds, but I don't think that this game will be feeling the brunt impact of the storm at kickoff. With that said, Miami in off of a 35-21 win against Georgia Tech. They didn't look phenomenal in the game. I had a chance to catch quite a bit of this one, and it really hinged on a couple of turnovers and mistakes that Georgia Tech made. Miami was able to strike quickly and put a bunch of points on the board, and then kind of just Georgia Tech has a trouble playing from behind, as you know, with that offense. They get out of there with a 35-21 victory, and we already touched on Florida State, their terrible loss, very disappointing loss to UNC, 37-35 on the last second, 40-yard field goal. Does Florida State have the motivation they need to get up for this game, knowing that their chances of an ACC title game and the national championship are all but gone? On the other side, you have a Miami team who's still looking very strong, still very much to play their way into national title consideration, the 14 playoff. How do you see it playing out, Rob, on Saturday night?
Hey, this one's interesting if we just look at it once again from a fundamental angle, Rob, because Miami's run defense has been so good this year. However, last week they did give up 267 yards to a predominantly ground-based football team in Georgia Tech, the Paul Johnson option. Everybody knows they run the ball 54 times last week, 267 total yards, 4.9 per carry. In those rush numbers, as we know, the sack totals get piled in there. So if you want to minus out the sack totals, you wind up with 50 carries for Georgia Tech for 286 yards. That's getting very close to 6 yards a pop on offense. Now, Florida State doesn't run the option. That's not why I'm using this these numbers to kind of equate to correlate to this game. But Florida State has to get Dalvin Cook involved in their offense, and they have lately. When he's running well, they're a much better football team. In the beginning of the year, we didn't see Dalvin Cook running well. First couple of games, a lot of the pressure was put on DeAndre Francois. Just not as good of a football team when you're playing teams of the caliber of the Miami Hurricanes. It's hard to tell and I think you made a great point about Miami. If I'm not mistaken, I think they returned 2 fumbles for touchdown in that game. In the second quarter, all of a sudden, they put together like a 21-point burst, and it was basically, like you said, done off of turnovers that were very, very quick strike scores for the Hurricanes. I don't know that they'll get that this week against Florida State, but certainly their defense under Mark Richt has been real good, much improved, and a lot of the reason why they are where they are now, sitting undefeated. Both of these teams dislike each other, so I don't think either will come without 100% focus. Both of these teams are going to be focused and ready to go. It's just a question of, at this point in time, which is the better one, and I almost give that advantage over to the Miami Hurricanes, although Florida State, if you're just looking at strength of schedule and the opponents that they've played, knowing what we know now, Florida State's played Ole Miss, who we know is a top 10 caliber football team despite having 2 losses already. They've played Louisville, who we know is a top 10 caliber football team. They played South Florida, who could go out and win the AAC this year. They're that much improved, South Florida is. And they've played North Carolina. Those are 4 solid football teams, so there's been nothing easy about the Florida State schedule so far, and perhaps they're a little more prepared for this level of competition than are the Miami Hurricanes, who haven't had it as tough as far as schedule is concerned, playing Florida A&M, Florida Atlantic, Appalachian State, and Georgia Tech. So therein lies your argument for the Florida State Seminoles, that they're far more battle-tested than Miami is. And we're going to find out if Miami's for real. We know Brad Kaya is a good quarterback, and they've got good running backs here. They've got a lot of talent. But it's the defense that I'd look for here. Let's see if this Miami defense is as good as the overall statistical numbers tell us. I'm not sure it is. Like I say, Georgia Tech found holes in that rush defense last week. If Florida State can find the same, this will be somewhat of a slugfest, and I almost would lean towards Florida State just because the strength of schedule has been so much better than what Miami's has been. The power rating suggests Florida State should be a 0.5 point favorite. It didn't open that way. It opened with Miami -2. Big total of 65.5. At this point in time, Rob, if you're playing over-unders in Florida State games, I'm not sure that you could give me one good reason to play under in any of their games, except for this game gets extremely affected by the Hurricane. Otherwise, Florida State games are they're offensive shows at this point in time. Their defense without Derwin James hasn't really been able to stop good offensive opponents, and they faced a whole handful of them. So I would look at that number, 65.5, and say if you're going to play totals in Florida State games, just keep playing them over till the odds makers make them too high to get over.
Rob, I think I kind of gave it away here, but our make or break game of the week is Virginia Tech and UNC. Obviously, this game could be impacted by the weather, depending on the track and timing of the storm. UNC off the 37-35 win. Don't need to talk about that anymore. Virginia Tech off of a bye week. Virginia Tech's first conference game of the year. What do you see here, really why this is the make or break game is neither of these teams can afford to get a second loss on the season, and neither of them want to get their first conference loss of the year either.
Yeah, and these are divisional foes. Both of these teams play in the Coastal, where, as we said earlier, it's really competitive, so it's an important game for both sides here. And you wonder if North Carolina has one more in them, right? I mean, the way they've won the last 2 weeks kind of sets up to where, they might either it's just a huge confidence boost, Rob, or they're exhausted when you have to sell out like they've had to sell out to win at the end of games the last 2 weeks. It's difficult to play 3 of those games in a row without feeling some fatigue. Elijah Hood, I talked about earlier, watch that injury. He got hurt against Virginia Tech. I'm looking at it now as as him being listed as probable for this game, which is huge for UNC. They need him. And it looks like Ryan Switzer will play as well. So all of the offensive weapons will be there. The defense still hasn't looked good. You can move against this team. I don't know about yourself, Rob, but it's kind of surprising to me that Gene Chizik hasn't upgraded this defense this year. Last year he came in. They played really good for the first 6 games, maybe 6 or 7 games, and then the end of the season, the back third, I think was disastrous for that defense, especially against the run. And that's kind of continued into this season for UNC. They just haven't upgraded on the defensive side of the football the way I thought they might under Chizik's direction. This is a team that's got all the offensive weaponry in the world. If they could ever find a little bit of a defense, I think we could boost them up even higher at this point in time nationally. But they're going to play a Virginia Tech team. Jared Evans, the quarterback for this squad, a JC kid who, before they played the game against Tennessee in Bristol Motor Speedway, was quoted as saying, the most people I've ever played in front of is 250. And then he goes to Bristol Motor Speedway and plays in front of about 140,000. So he's getting much better as the weeks go on. And right now, this offense, Justin Fuente, who came over from Memphis to coach this football team, their offense gets better and better every single week. I'd be fearful of this team right now, Virginia Tech, because the one smart thing they did in that complete coaching overhaul was they maintained Bud Foster, the defensive coordinator of 20-plus years for Virginia Tech. And that defense, when you match them up against North Carolina's defense, you match them up against Miami's defense, or any of those teams in the Coastal, I'd make the argument they're the best defense right now. So with the offense playing the way they are, that spread attack, looks like the kids are getting far more comfortable in that system. I think they're the team to watch in the Coastal right now.
Well, Rob, I think that that takes care of the card that we had laid out to discuss this week. Again, final thoughts are please check the website for weather reports throughout the weekend. Rob, any final words before we wrap it up for this week?
Yeah, not much. I think we've covered it all, Rob. I would say this. You asked me earlier, and maybe I made an omission here, of teams that have climbed or dropped in the power ratings. But let me just say that we talked about teams that have dropped, but one team that has been extremely impressive so far this season and climbed up the power ratings is Colorado out in the Pac-12. So for those that are going to get involved in the Colorado game this week, it seems that quarterback has not mattered. Sefo Liufau gets hurt. Freshman Steven Montez comes in and does great things the last couple of weeks for CU. But that's a team that really has made great strides and has risen up the power ratings.
Well, Rob, I did not notice that you only gave me the teams that went down. Glad to hear there is somebody doing well this year and rising in your power rankings. And with that, I would like to just thank you all for listening to our Week 6 early look on a Tuesday evening. Please remember, check robvenosports.com for all the latest weather information leading up to what could or could not be a very crazy weather weekend in the world of college football. robvenosports.com, great source for all of your handicapping info, and, of course, your selections from myself, Rob Veno, and Derek Davis. With that, we will say see you next week for a Week 7 early look ahead. Thanks for listening, everybody.